Thank you. All right, welcome to the EPAC meeting. Thanks for joining on a Friday. I know this is not a normal time for a EPAC meeting, but we had to kind of move schedules around for various reasons, and we wanted to make sure we got results in front of you all as soon as we could. So thanks for joining. Today, we wanted to go through two more sensitivities that have been done since our previous meeting, and then NICE will walk through those in a second. Before they jump in with that, I wanted to just kind of give a high-level overview of where we stand right now in the CGPP. So we're still in stage one. We're still wrapping up the sensitivities in the capacity expansion modeling. The sensitivities you're about to see today are sensitivities 4 and 5 that we run so far. We have up to 5 more we can do. So we're still scoping those out. We have 2 new sensitivities that are under development right now, based off of the stakeholder feedback we've received. And so those will be presented at a previous meeting. The 3 remaining sensitivities that have yet to be decided, those will be reserved for later. You know, the utilities, the NISO, and members of the state team will try to design those sensitivities to kind of be responsive to whatever other feedback hasn't been incorporated already into one of the sensitivities, and then to fill any other knowledge gaps that we have remaining after the first 6 or 7 sensitivities that we're able to run. Work on stage 2 has already begun on the main set of scenarios, at least for the first state scenario, the scenario 1 of the CGPP. But I did want to reiterate that something that we talked about last time on the call, and we can bring it up again later, but the sensitivity that we have run that introduced a new type of DFIR, high capacity, low operating cost DFIR, diverged significantly from all the other scenarios and sensitivities in terms of renewable build out and locations, and that is something we discussed last time as a key driver of potentially lowering the transmission needs in that case, quite a bit lower probably even than the original scenario 2, which was designed to lower the transmission needs in that scenario. So we had discussed last time that those results justified promoting that sensitivity up to one of the main scenarios so that it could flow through the remaining stages of the CGPP and identify the actual solution set that actually enables that build out. So I think we're still in that mindset, but if you'll recall from last time, that initial run with that new DFIR had a couple tweaks we wanted to make to it in terms of where the new DFIR was allowed to be cited and what the type of increased cost for developing that type of resource downstate would be. And so that's one of the sets of results you'll see today is that new updated version of that sensitivity. And that updated version is the one that would take the place of scenario 2, our original scenario 2, because of the low transmission needs. So just wanted to kind of give that reminder and overview. The primary meat of the meeting today is going to be a NISO presentation of sensitivities 4 and 5. But before we jump into that, I just want to see if anybody had any questions. Go ahead, Bill.
Yes, Skylar. I think it's very interesting that scenario did result in potentially a lot lower transmission build out needs, and certainly very supportive of exploring that further as a scenario. I'm wondering if since the original scenario 2 tried to explore lower transmission needs through a different mechanism than what we discovered was an effective mechanism with the DFIRs. I'm wondering if there's even a further additive effect of those 2 mechanisms, the high DER, high energy storage version of scenario 2, combined with the DFIR piece. And I'd love to have your thoughts or other people's thoughts on whether that's something we might want to explore in one of your future sensitivities.
Oh yes, I see what you're saying. So, I think we increased for the original scenario 2, we increased the amount of flexibility in the model. We reduced the cost of storage, and we increased the amount of distributed PV. So all things that would lead to kind of a lower transmission need likely. But I don't think we did any of those things in that new sensitivity. The primary difference in the new sensitivity was just a new type of defer that dramatically reduced the amount of large-scale renewables required in that modeling as the primary method of reducing. So I guess I see if we did both at the same time, that would reduce it further. So that's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, I'd encourage that. Thank you.
Any other questions before we jump in? All right, sounds good. So NISO folks, it's over to you.
Hey, thanks, Skylar. Keith Burrell from the NISO. Our primary presenter today is going to be Kevin Ravis, as typical in walking everybody through the capacity expansion results for sensitivities 4 and 5. Skylar, before Kevin gets too far along here, what my memory is telling me, and sorry to raise this question here, if I would have thought of it earlier, I would have emailed it over. But would it be of benefit to remind folks on the call? So I believe sensitivity 4 was from some specific feedback from EPAC members. Would it be helpful to specifically identify those? I think it may have been a combination of perhaps a few EPAC members into one sensitivity. Would you be able to talk to that a little bit? If not,
yeah, sure.
Later.
Sure. So sensitivity 4 was the sensitivity that was proposed by ACE New York, I believe, as an expansion on the copper sheet analysis, where after seeing the copper sheet analysis and everything, those results were still showing kind of that headroom was binding still in a lot of places, and this sensitivity was designed to further unconstrain the model, to see where the model would be placing resources if it didn't have those extra, headroom costs and build limit constraints in the model. So this is kind of like a high large scale renewable almost, or a high renewable energy zone type analysis where there's no transmission constraints to speak of. It's a copper sheet analysis. There's no LCRs. There's no cost to headroom, and there's no annual build limit. So the model can literally just pick whatever available resources it sees in kind of any given year. And so that's what scenario 4 is. And as I had mentioned, sensitivity 4. And sensitivity 5 is just the reiteration of sensitivity 3, fixing some of the tweaks in downstate about the new defer we added.
Thanks for that, Skylar. With that background, Kevin, go ahead and take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Skylar. So yeah, today I'll be getting into the results for sensitivities 4 and 5. I'll start by just reviewing the assumptions as you've just heard about them, but just for the sake of being clear here, I'll go ahead and review them one more time, but give an overview of the two sensitivities, and then we'll get into the comparison of those sensitivities to the state scenario, as well as some analysis on those. And so this sensitivity, we're doing sensitivities 4 and 5. We've already presented results for sensitivities 1 and 3 at a previous EPAC. So that presentation, as well as the results for that, should be available on the EPAC website. And just as a reminder, the sensitivities here are used to examine impacts of changes to the CGPP scenarios, and the changes are identified by the joint utilities and provided to us at the NISO to run in the capacity expansion. And the current plan is to run 10 total, and right now we've hit 5 and are developing the other ones. But let me get into the assumptions that we used for these cases. So here are all the cases we've run to date. So if anyone needs to review what we did for 1 through 3, that's always available. But for sensitivity 4, as Keith and Skylar were discussing, this is a sort of concentrated renewable zone scenario. and it is run off of the state scenario. And the adjustments that are made in this case is we don't have any headroom constraining in the model. So there's no headroom constraint modeled whatsoever. There is no annual UPV build limit. And it's also inclusive of the assumptions for sensitivity 1, where we have the copper sheet in place, as well as eliminating LCR requirements. For sensitivity 5, it is an alternate defer option case similar to sensitivity 3, but with some additional constraints. So just to remind folks on this is the state scenario with different defer options, and those are the high capital, low operating option, as well as a hydrogen fuel cell option. But just to note that this sensitivity does not include the hydrogen combustion defer option. And the additional constraints that we have in sensitivity 5 here is the maximum allowable capacity of the high capital, low operating defer option is 500 megawatts in zones F and G. And so I'll also talk about this on the next slide, but the high capital, low operating option is only available in zones A through G. And in zones A through E, it's unlimited, but in zones F through G, it has this 500 megawatt cap. And then we further modified the costs here with like zonal capital cost multipliers. So let me just jump to the next slide to discuss that. So in the original sensitivity 3, we ran the case with the cost numbers outlined here in these bullets. But as we've done for other scenarios, like when a resource is available in downstate zones like GH and I or J and K, the costs have been increased based on some data and some multipliers to make that cost higher. So that's what we have applied in this new sensitivity. So here you see the details on the alternate defer option case, but really it's very similar to the third sensitivity that we did. And the blue text here indicates what actually changed. So just really adding that cap to zones F and G and then that cost multiplier. So with that, I can start to get into the results of sensitivity 4 here, the concentrated renewable zone sensitivity. And first, talking about the key findings at the NICA level. So this sensitivity is showing that driven by the removal of the UPV build limit, and just to remind on what that was, it was a 2.5 gigawatt per year annual limit on the amount of UPV that could be built in the model. So we took that constraint out, and that allows more UPV to be built. And so the results are showing approximately 10 gigawatt increase in UPV capacity by 2042. And just to note on the supply curve for UPV, so a reminder that the supply curve is a assumption that we use based on an analysis that was done in partnership with NYSERDA on how much capacity is available in different zones for different technologies like UPV, land-based wind, offshore wind. We analyze that here, and with the 10 gigawatt increase in UPV, we check that against the supply curve. And just to note that zone D does reach its zonal limit according to that data and that constraint. But for the other zones, it is not quite hitting the maximum. So just some additional info on that there. And so this additional UPV is coupled with an additional 5 gigawatts of batteries. And these batteries not only serve capacity needs, but also provide 1.5 times more generation than in the outlook state scenario. And that's to balance the UPV. So a lot of times we see the batteries being built for just capacity in some of our cases where they're built, but they're not operating at a significant level or more relative to other cases. But in this case, we are seeing an increase of generation from the battery. And that is due to just having higher UPV on the system. So this increase in UPV and battery does offset 4 gigawatts of capacity and the associated energy from offshore wind, and results in only the minimum capacity required for the CLCPA, so the 9 gigawatts by 2035. And the UPV and battery also offsets some land-based wind. It's about a 3 gigawatt decrease of land-based wind by the end of the model period, and some of the DFR, so about a 1.5 gigawatt decrease. And also, just of note, is that the land-based wind is no longer reaching its maximum according to the supply curve. And that is just because there's more energy coming from UPV in this case. And the DFR retrofit option, which is still in sensitivity 4, which has no capital costs, are still preferred to meet capacity needs and continue to show little utilization, as we are seeing in the state scenario. But there is slightly less of that DFR capacity and energy compared to the state scenario. So getting into what that actually looks like here, this is a new comparison slide that we have here. A lot of this information is stuff that we typically present when we do these slides, but it's just compiled in a different way. So for example, the table here is just showing the end state in 2042 between the state scenario and sensitivity 4. Whereas in other slides, we've shown like for a single case for all of the different years, 2025, 2030, and so on. But here we just have the comparison in 2042. And here's where we can see that increase in UPV capacity, as well as a decrease in offshore wind capacity, and then the increase in energy from that UPV as well, relative to the state scenario, and a decrease in offshore wind. And so I'm actually going to discuss these points in some following slides, particularly the zonal. I'll get into that, but I'm just going to keep going here on the slides and discuss this data going forward here. So here's the direct comparison of state scenario and sensitivity 4 at the NICA level for all of the years. And this is where we can see, again, like the last slide, increase in UPV capacity, increase in battery, and that's offsetting some DFR, land-based wind and offshore wind. Again, increase in energy from UPV, decreasing some other technologies. But let's look at it from a delta perspective. So here's where you can really see how UPV, or like the magnitude of UPV offsetting from other resources from a capacity perspective, as well as an energy perspective. So fairly decent exchange or offset happening here. And when we get into the upstate versus downstate comparison, so compared to the state scenario, there are fewer capacity additions in the downstate zones. And this is reflective of a combination of the cost assumptions. There's no LCR requirement here, and there's also no transmission constraints. So because of this constraint relaxation, there's no UPV built downstate, and the storage capacity moves upstate. And in addition, downstate retrofits are still preferred. As I had mentioned, they're still showing they're meeting capacity needs, but show little utilization. And compared to the state scenario, the upstate zones are showing approximately 24 gigawatts more nameplate capacity, with the growth mainly in UPV and battery capacity. So let's take a look at that visually here. So again, fairly significant increase in upstate with UPV and battery, a shifting of resources from downstate to upstate, just through the relaxation of multiple constraints. So no LCR requiring it downstate. The model's allowed to build more UPV, and upstate zones, as you'll see, zone E in a bit, is more economic as well. So lots of reasons driving this change here. So on the zonal perspective, so again, the combination of our assumptions. Go ahead, question. Was there a question? Okay. So zonal perspective, combination and cost assumptions, no LCR, no headroom, no transmission. This is driving an increase in zone E capacity, particularly UPV. This is reflective of low county level capital costs, no storage needed in downstate, particularly due to the removal of LCR. Downstate retrofits, no capital costs still preferred. So iterating some points that I've made here. But similar levels of capacity remain in most upstate zones except for zone E. So this is just like an interesting trend that we're seeing. So most zones have a similar level of capacity. Zone E increases significantly. So this is showing us that the offshore wind generation from J&K in the state scenario was mostly offset by UPV generation in zone E. And then that UPV generation was balanced with all the batteries that are in the upstate zones. So looking at the zonal information here, getting to that point of a lot of the zones have similar levels of like UPV land-based wind versus zone E showing that significant increase and a decrease of offshore wind downstate and a shifting of resources into the upstate zones. On the battery
question. So I've got a question from Radhika.
Yes. Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So I have a question on this zoning increase. So are you saying that the model is adding solar PV in zone E because of lower capex than offshore wind and because there are no local capacity constraints? I'm curious why zone E, or interested in knowing like why zone E, it's almost like maxing out that supply curve. And we don't see more capacity in other zones, for instance, zone C or A. Like what's driving maxing out zone E versus other zones?
Yep, that's a great question. And it goes back to if there are no other constraints in the model or no additional costs associated with all of this E capacity. Like for example, when we have headroom, it's adding cost to build in a single zone. But when we don't have those sorts of constraints on the model, it's really just going to go back to economics and what is the cheapest zone and the cheapest resource available. And so zone E has a lot of supply available. That's according to the supply curve analysis. So there's a lot available, and it's also, according to our cost assumptions, the cheapest zone for UPV in the model. And so that's what the model just takes advantage of essentially. And that's why we're seeing so much in zone E. Okay,
so once all those constraints are removed, it comes down to the assumptions made on the capital cost and NCF of solar across the zones. So that difference becomes the most significant one. And I'm saying that because, for instance, zone C is kind of like what you call like part of southern tier. You have more potential based on the supply curve, the NYSERDA supply curve, Power Advisory NYSERDA supply curve, but you don't get to there. So I think the other zones are not maxed out because you still have a lot in zone E. So that's how one would read the additions, the decision in the model. So maybe a question or something to, I mean, like a question becomes like how, like zone E, I don't remember if we have one capital cost or there are like different tiers of resources at different capital costs. Because maybe some resources are cheaper versus others in that area as you add more generation.
Yep. Yep. So your understanding of the data, definitely agree. And that sounded right to me. In terms of the capital cost assumptions, we do model it at a county level. So there are like different tiers based on the counties. And then within each county, I believe we have like 2 tiers within. So like Jefferson County, for example, will have one cost that's lower and a second cost that's a little bit higher to try to be more realistic about just having tiers, like you say.
Thank you.
Yeah, one other point of clarification I'll make here to that question that was being raised, and that goes to the supply curve. What I reference here in this response is the NYSO's presentation at the tech conference. We did have a slide. I want to say it's somewhere in the middle. It's like slide 7, I think it's slide 17. At least that's what I have it here in my notes. The solar build out, or the solar supply curve limitation in zone E, is actually about 35 gigawatts. And zone C is somewhere around 7 or 8. So I think that's an important point of clarification. It could be, maybe I misunderstood some of the comments, so I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on that in no instance here is the actual supply curve for solar being met. I think in probably any of the zones, but it is getting close.
Yeah.
Kevin, would you concur? Kevin, do you concur with that, or did I mess any of that data up?
I concur, Keith. Yeah, that's a good clarification. Thank you.
And we have a hand raised from Anna.
Yeah, thanks. This is Anna Summer from Energy Futures Group on behalf of WEACT. I had a question about what seems to be the model substituting UPV and storage for offshore wind. It doesn't seem like it's a one-for-one replacement just based on kind of eyeballing your chart. So it's adding more UPV on a megawatt basis than the offshore wind that it's taking out of the state scenario run. Which I think makes sense because I would expect that offshore wind has a higher capacity factor than UPV does. But I guess what's surprising is that those two are even substitutable, because I would, without having the benefit of like looking at your renewable shapes, I would guess that a lot of the value of that offshore wind comes during times when UPV isn't going to produce much energy, and that it would be hard to make up that difference between with a combination of UPV and 4-hour storage. And so I'm just curious if you think that that is a realistic outcome, or if that's really a result of the time sampling settings in the LT runs.
Yeah, that's a great point. Of course, yes, like you're saying, there's advantages of offshore winds having energy available through the evening periods and things like this. I think just onto the next slide here, I think that helps. Like the model is choosing to build both 4-hour and 8-hour storage. So I think there's perhaps the 8-hour is helping to bridge that gap a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And then also in this case, like we don't have any sort of like transmission constraints. So I think that also plays a role here, in that it's not limited in how it's sending the energy from upstate to downstate. So I think the combination of these factors are leading to like a realistic result in terms of the model. But again, it is based on a lot of assumptions. But I think the 8-hour here is probably the key point that helps helps the UPV meet that need.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'll keep moving here. So the storage, seeing how it's split out between 4-hour and 8-hour. We're seeing roughly the same 4-hour capacity that we're seeing in the state scenario, but yeah, it is building 2 times more of the 8-hour capacity, likely driven by the removal of LCRs. But to our conversation here, it could be driven by what is actually needed to meet the energy. And then on the DFR build by type, so not a lot changing here. Mostly the model is still taking advantage of those retrofit options that are in both of the cases.
Quick question.
Yep.
Hey, this is Shadab Ali from Nextera. On slide 15, I'm curious if there are no transmission constraint. I'm kind of curious to see that the model is still showing 6 gigawatt storage in zone J. I think it should place where it's most economical to place that storage, right? So can you explain that how this is going to zone J without any transmission constraint? I would expect that to go to upstate.
Yep. So what we have here, so x-axis, the double S is state scenario, and the S4 is the sensitivity.
Okay. Yep. My bad. Thank you.
Yeah. Gotcha.
A comment on the phone also. This is Shaja Naipa. Compared to this slide that you just have with the previous one, looking at a zone D, you see this one you see SS zone D, right, versus S4. SS actually has a higher energy storage. The pink bar is higher, but when you go to the next slide, it's reversed. So is that something mixed? You see here, yeah, this one, the pink bar on zone D, SS, the state scenario is higher, but the next one, SS4 is higher.
That's a great question. I see what you're saying.
Because I was wondering why zone D here, as for the buys, the total buy is lower. So looks like the difference was the energy storage, but the next diagram, seems reverse.
Yep, you're certainly right that does not look correct. So we'll take this back and check on this. Yeah, it looks like there could potentially be a reporting issue. So we will look into that.
Okay, because I was wondering why zone D and zone G, also zone G, the S4 number is lower. So
okay.
Yeah, these capture my attention. Yeah, thank you.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much. All right, so just getting into the last section of the sensitivity 4 results here is on the representative days. So the representative days data is something that we have presented in slides previously, but we saw some interesting findings with respect to this case, so we wanted to discuss those. So when we consider the inclusion of charging and electrolysis that would happen as a result of system with more UPV and more batteries, we're seeing that midday peaking is increasing by a fairly sizable amount in sensitivity 4. So the summer peak with charging electrolysis is approximately 15 gigawatts higher as a result of this additional UPV generation, which is used for battery charging. And other representative days are showing similar trends, though it's less significant in, say, like the winter period when there's less UPV available. But more battery generation in sensitivity 4 is reducing the need for some DFR generation at peak. And the 2042 total DFR generation is about half of what it was in the state scenario. So just for reference. But I think this really pops out when we look at the visuals here. So with more solar and more battery, for example, the summer peak day is shown in this section here. And when I'm referring to midday peaking, I'm talking about this period of time here, and we can see how high that is, and how it's taking advantage of the solar generation to charge batteries. And so when we look at that in comparison to the state scenario, here's the summer peak for the state scenario, you can see that that is a fairly sizable amount higher, so about 15 gigawatts higher. And even on this next slide, we do a delta of this data. And so we can see how the solar energy is offsetting the offshore wind and some land-based wind, as well as some deferred. So this is a very simplified version. We do not have the storage accounted for here, right, which would make up for some of these periods where the solar is not generating. But really, just a simple exchange of energy is what we're trying to show here. And then we just put the two cases side by side. So state scenario, summer peak on the left, sensitivity 4 on the right. Again, just to highlight that comparison between the two. And we did the same for the winter peak. So here's where we can see winter peak is getting more charging and solar during the midday period, but not as significant because there's not as much solar available in the wintertime. So with that brings me to the end of this section, and I can get into the next case, sensitivity 5. But I guess I'll pause here. Might as well take questions on this case if there are any at this point.
This is Nick Culbepper, PhD Long Island. Can you go back to the previous slide? I thought I saw something that may trigger a question, but so am I seeing energy storage as both load and as dispatch on the state scenario? Could you explain that?
Yeah, definitely. Yep, you'd be correct in that. That's what you're seeing. And the reason for this is so the state scenario still has all of the transmission constraints in it. So that means that, and we're looking at a NICA level picture. So what is happening upstate could be different than what's happening downstate, for example. Like in one part of the state, you could have charging that's occurring, but in another part of the state, you have a discharge that's happening. So the simultaneous charge and discharge isn't necessarily, just seems realistic based on the model assumptions in that case. Does that help?
Gotcha. Now that nails it. Thanks, Kevin. Sure.
Kevin, Bill Acker, just to further clarify that, it's my understanding though this model assumes the batteries start the day at 0 charge, so they have to charge and discharge in the same day in order to be in your model. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so I think that's something that, you know, if we got to a multi-day model in the future, we could have more realistic assumptions for peak days where they wouldn't charge on a peak day most likely, but in this model they have to do that. So I mean, it's still valuable, but it's something we caveat we should note.
Yeah, fair enough. Yep.
Like Radhika is next.
Yeah, I have a question. What do you think would be the impact of adding back the LCR requirements? Would that limit Zone E serving the downstate zones? I'm trying to understand. Offshore wind it's replaced essentially by solar because of not having the incremental headroom added to solar, or is it because of the local constraints being removed, LCR being removed?
So I think first part of your question, if we had the LCRs in the case, we would certainly see a larger build out in the downstate zones, like particularly J and K. You might see something where something closer to the state scenario, you might not get as much of the shifting of battery to upstate, for example, and potentially could see more offshore wind. I am, speculating, but based on just like that requirement to have more capacity within the certain regions, most certainly we would see capacity moved back down into those zones. And then the second part of your question, do you mind repeat? It was about zone E, but do you mind just?
I think
figuring
that
out
answered it. I was trying to understand how much those 10 gigawatts of solar is from removing the local constraints versus not having that incremental headroom in the model. Incremental headroom cost in the model. Because
Yeah,
in the state scenario, when you add renewables, you also add incremental headroom cost. And I assume you're not doing that in this sensitivity, or do you do that in this sensitivity? Or how
this
do
does
you?
not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does not have the incremental headroom cost. So that would certainly, if that was in here, it may make like zone E less economic, for example, and it would likely spread that solar capacity out more. To say if it's the single driver or for zone E, I don't know that I can say it right at this moment, but I think yeah, headroom certainly is a driver of, and without it in this case, it allows more in E because it's just so economic.
Mm-hmm. And if, for instance, like the characteristics of renewables from zone E would be in zone C, for instance, will just the model, like the result will be just what we have today for zone E, it will be in zone C. So it's just like what we assume on the supply curve becomes very important in this type of sensitivity because it drives where you have the most renewables.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And I think we've seen that in other scenarios and sensitivities as well. For example, like the headroom assumption, all zones, being the same and all the upstate zones having very similar characteristics, where if something says in the model it might be zone E or zone C, but it could just be a fraction of a dollar, cheaper just based on the inputs than say zone B or A or something like that. So I think I agree with your line of questioning. It's not necessarily that this is like proof of something or this is the definitive answer. It's like based on the supply curve costs and capacity availability estimates. This is what literally pops out of the model. But when we look through in reality or when we're allocating those resources in a model, if there's something that looks more reasonable, but the model is missing some amount of information, or we think that the headroom allocation would be slightly different, then in reality it might actually pick different zones upstate that have very similar resource availability and characteristics. It's just the model is seeing it as just ever so slightly different and going with the cheaper option.
Yeah, and I maybe one last comment and then I stop. It does seem to bring the point of like the headroom assumptions are very important, and like how much it costs, what the solution is for unlocking more renewables in each zone becomes very important because maybe another zone could have been maxed out if the cost of the headroom is less than zone E, for instance. So the assumption on the headroom cost becomes very important in how you get to that headroom in like 2 gigawatts or 3 gigawatts, hybrid, local, bulk becomes very important. Thank you.
Veronica, thinking about your question, is Keith from the NISO. I'm wondering if you were to take a look at sensitivity 1, that was the copper sheet with no LCR. It left headroom costs in, I believe. But it also left in the 2.5 gigawatt per year solar build limitation. So I think that would possibly go a long way to answer some of your questions as to what it would look like. So that may be helpful if you were to.
Yeah,
be able to
thank you.
What you do see there, just to talk to it verbally, you see, for instance, in zone E, so this would be sensitivity 1. Going back to that, you would see about 15 gigawatts of solar in zone E, and in zone J, since I think you were asking about that, you see no batteries still, but the overall land-based wind is about 7 or 8 gigawatts, and it does have a fair amount of DFR capacity that's still built, somewhere on the order of about 7 or 8, or probably 6-ish, of something like that.
Thank you, Keith.
I think we're back to William. Go by Bill. I apologize. Is it Bill?
I'm sorry, this is Bill, but I forgot to put my hand down. No, it's a leftover hand. Sorry.
Leftover hand. Excellent. All right. Kevin, I think we've wrapped up the hands are raised. I thought I may have seen a few that popped up and came off. Certainly feel free to keep raising your hand if your question remains unanswered.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Happy to field more questions on both cases, even at the end of this next section. But for now, I'll go ahead and get into sensitivity 5. So this is the alternate DFR option with the additional constraints. So what we're seeing in this case, so the NICA level findings in this sensitivity 5 are very similar to sensitivity 3. So we presented sensitivity 3 results. You may hear some points that sound familiar, and that's because the cases are very similar. But at the NICA level, when we remove the retrofit hydrogen combustion turbine option, this is leading to more battery storage being built. It's more economic with respect to its capital cost, and that's to serve capacity needs. And therefore, we're seeing more storage being built overall. And with more storage, we are also seeing less DFR is required to help serve capacity needs. So this trend in this type of battery build out was also observed in scenario 3, which also had the fuel cell DFR option, and the batteries become more economic than say the fuel cells here. But in the case where we have this high capital, low operating DFR and the sensitivity, it's contributing a significant portion of energy. So it's about 17% of 2042 NICA-wide generation. This is driven by its low operating cost, and it also doesn't have an attachment to electrolysis, for example. So it doesn't, when we have a hydrogen resource, if it generates, it also adds electrolysis load onto the system. This is optimized by the model. And the high capital operating option does not have that tie. And this high capital low operating option is providing both a significant portion of energy, as well as it has a high firm capacity. And for this reason, less resources, particularly offshore wind, UPV, and land-based wind, are required relative to the state scenario. And just of note, the offshore wind capacity does not exceed the 9 gigawatt requirement under the CLCPA in this case. And the capacity limitations for land-based wind per the supply curve, and UPV, the annual build limit for UPV here, these have not been reached in sensitivity 5 like they were in like CGPP scenarios 1 through 3 and what we've seen in some other cases. So again, we have,
Real quick,
go ahead.
what were the LCR and headroom assumptions here, and whether we had a copper sheet or not?
Yes, good to review that. Thank you. This one does not have a copper sheet, and I believe LCRs are in place. No copper sheet, just the normal transmission constraints. It's really just an adjustment of the defer option in this case.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Another
thanks
way
for
to
the
do that, Kevin, is
reminder.
unless it's stated here, it was left exactly the same as the state scenario.
Yep. Yeah, thank you for that. It's good to recalibrate the brain on this.
Kevin, this is Nick Goldberger with PC Long Island. Am I right? Is there a small exception to that statement on UPV as it pertains to Zone K? Didn't that max out its supply curve again, similar to state scenario? I know it's small potatoes compared to the rest of the state, but is that accurate?
That is a fair question. I actually don't know off the top of my head. Was more focused on that annual limit. So I actually do not know, but we can follow up on that.
Thanks.
So yeah, getting into the comparison of the end states for the different cases, we have state scenario. We also have sensitivity 3 and sensitivity 5. In the upcoming slides, we're primarily focused on the comparison of sensitivity 5 to the state scenario, but we understand, there's kind of a natural question of like, okay, how does sensitivity 5 relate to the third sensitivity? So we wanted to present that here. Just to highlight a couple points. We're seeing a similar amount of the high capital, low operating capacity being built by 2042. But compared to sensitivity 3, sensitivity 5 has more of the fuel cell capacity being built. And we see this as being driven by LCRs downstate. There's less of this, like in sensitivity 3, a lot of this high capital, low operating option was being built in zone G, but with it being limited in this new case, we see that it ends up building more of the fuel cell option. And it also does some exchange of storage here, where sensitivity 3 had a fairly high amount of storage at 28 gigawatts. It only builds 25 in sensitivity 5. So more fuel cell, but less storage in this new case. So now we'll primarily be doing comparison of sensitivity 5 to the state scenario. But before we even get there, we want to level set on the defer capacity, because in some of the upcoming slides, you'll see that the defer capacity gets lumped together. But here we just break it out to lay that out first. And so when you see capacity numbers being reported for sensitivity 5, it's roughly a 60-40 split between fuel cells and high capital, low operating options. But when we look at it from an energy perspective, that high capital, low operating is providing the majority of the energy and operating at a really high capacity factor, while the fuel cell option is at a low capacity factor of only like 5% here. And on the electrolysis front, we just wanted to show the comparison of how this looks. We've removed the hydrogen combustion option, there's fuel cells, but how does this compare on an electrolysis front? So we're actually seeing a little bit of an increase in electrolysis load in sensitivity 5. And this is due to a 1 terawatt hour increase in the hydrogen generation relative to the state scenario. So a little bit more electrolysis here. So here's our typical NICA level comparison. So we see the removal of the retrofits leads to more battery storage capacity. It's more economic for serving capacity needs. With more storage, we have less DFR overall. And then on the energy front, here's where you can see visually that significant contribution from the high capital, low operating option. And again, on the deltas here, when we add the high capital, low operating option, we see a reduction in the total renewable plus DFR build out by about 25 gigawatts and an increase in storage by about 9 gigawatts. So it's on net, that's about 16 gigawatts less on the nameplate capacity. And just to note, the total DFR capacity build out is in 2042 is less than the total amount of fossil retirement. So that was just an interesting observation that we had seen. So for example, looking at what the fossil amount is today versus what the DFR amount is at the end of the model, we just noticed that is less there.
A question on the phone.
Yep.
Hey, Kevin, Chris Wentland. Just real quick on your case where you have the high capacity type DFR unit that results in less of wind and solar required. Did you also look at the T&D build out requirement, and do you have that quantified?
Yep, we did. And I'm happy to just go ahead and jump there. With this high capital, low operating option, we are seeing that it's resulting in a fairly sizable reduction in the amount of headroom being the representation of the local transmission. We're seeing that because of this new DFR option, it is resulting in less of that being built. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep. Cool. So I'll jump back up, but glad to address that one. On the upstate versus downstate comparison here and the findings there, we're seeing similar trends in terms of our resource build and our distribution in sensitivity 5, but there's less resources that are required overall, both upstate and downstate, again, just due to high capital operating, providing capacity and energy. And similar to the state scenario, we're seeing in sensitivity 5 a balance of storage between upstate and downstate. This is driven by the need to satisfy LCRs. And just kind of for reference, and interesting point that we found here is, if the high capital operating resource is assumed to be like a small modular reactor. I know the high capital operating in this case could be a representation of SMRs or long duration storage. But one thing that we noted is this is effectively a doubling of the existing nuclear capacity upstate. So just something to keep in mind. But here's where we can see the reduction of resources, particularly in upstate, that's required because of that that high capital operating option. So really, in the state scenario, imagine the chunks of DFR is providing capacity, but not a lot of energy. But then in sensitivity 5, particularly from the upstate is where we're getting the high capital operating option versus a lot of fuel cells downstate. Just imagine that this chunk is providing a significant amount more of energy, and that's why it's offsetting and decreasing some of the nameplate capacity required here. On the zonal level, so just a reminder, high capital operating only available in zones A through G. Zones F through G have that 500 megawatt limit per zone in addition here. And the results are showing that is being fully utilized. And then the majority of this DFR option is built in zone C. The new fuel cells are primarily built downstate, mostly to serve LCRs. And we know that they're mostly serving LCRs because they have their capacity there, but there's very little generation. So that's what is what tells us that it's for a capacity need. And the addition of the this is just iterating the coupling of energy and capacity on high capital operating again, but also just reiterating a point from earlier, this new distribution of resources requires less headroom as compared to the state scenario.
Question?
Yeah.
On slide 31.
Mm-hmm.
So basically in scenario 5, we need less resources because we have more storage. We are able to utilize more storage. Is that right? To serve the energy? And the fuel cell?
I don't know that the primary driver is the storage. I think the high capital, low operating option is what's providing most of the energy here, and it's able to do it throughout all periods of the day and operates more like a base load generator. And we have some slides to show that later, but I think that's really the big driver as opposed to the storage. Storage is mostly for capacity.
Okay, and those HCLOs are fuel cells here or the SMRs?
It's the high capital they're separate. So there's fuel cell option and the high capital operating, and the high capital operating is meant to be a representation of could be SMRs, could be long duration storage, things like this.
Yeah, I think that's where I made that point last time as well, because that's a big difference. SMR is definitely different. It can provide you high ELCC, right? Versus the storage. When you have the large 8-over storage, it may perform here, but I think if you have multi-day extreme weather event, extreme cold, extreme peak period, right? You will not have time to charge the storage. So I think that's something to consider. When you are in this analysis.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I would have to maybe defer on that one, maybe to DPS or joint utilities on it. But I think that point has been heard. So up to others if we want to discuss it more.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Kevin. We definitely recognize that difference. The long duration storage is supposed to represent something with the 50 to 100 hour range, and with our represented day representation in the Plexos modeling software we're using, it's hard, if not impossible, to actually do inter-day charging, discharging, that type of reliability planning. So that's something we'll have to do kind of post-processing to make sure we are kind of accounting for what other charging needs and reliability needs that might arise under these various scenarios. But here we're just trying to see, what is the model asking for? What does the model actually want to use? And when it's given the option to dispatch something for an entire day, it's taking that option in almost every single day, as opposed to building incremental capacity of solar or wind or offshore wind.
Yeah. Understand. I think that is the challenge, I mean, the model will show you can use the storage 8-hour, right, and full dispatch. I think that the challenge you will have in real-time operation is how would you charge that, for the next dispatch. So I understand there are challenges with that, how will you study that? But I think it's important when you are building these scenarios and you will take it to the next level for transmission analysis to understand all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And make the right assumptions here.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for that. Yep.
Yeah, definitely a good point.
Hey, Kevin, Chris Wentland, one additional question kind of to add to that. You have a limit, correct, from G through K on the high capacity type DFR?
So
And
Just quick, it's
go
not
ahead.
able to build outs like it is only allowed to be built A through G. So in the
Okay.
other downstate zones, it's not available.
And then do you have a maximum megawatt then for A through G that the model allows?
We do
per
not.
zone?
Yeah, we do not in zones A through E, but we do in F and G. So A through E, it can build as much as it finds economic and wants. But in F and G, that's where this case differs from sensitivity 3, is it limited what we could do in F and G to 500 megawatts only.
Okay. And then one other question would be, if you, I'm just using this as an example. Let's say you had 2,000 megawatts of this, and it was in one location versus A through F, it's kind of spread out. Does that result in a difference? Could that result in a difference in your total required generation and then also your total T&D?
Are you saying if it was placed in one zone versus
Yeah, if it's diversified across the state versus, let's say, focused in one location.
Yes, I think what we have, and I'll jump to this slide, is the model is allowed to optimize where it wants to diversify and place it. But to your point, like if it was concentrated in one zone, or it certainly would affect the T and the T&D and the headroom result, just because it's a difference in how the energy would get distributed. So hard to say what exactly, but it would certainly change something here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And just to follow up with this slide, like this is showing how the resources get distributed. And so, for example, the green bar is our high capital low operating. Our blue is the fuel cell. So we'll see fuel cells downstate primarily for serving LCR. We see the high capital low operating maxing out in zones F and G. But then we see the rest of the high capital low operating capacity being spread amongst other upstate zones. But the thing to keep in mind with this is like, okay, why is that being built in zone C? But the model is trying to optimize a bunch of other things in this case as well. So for example, like in zone E, you have all of your renewable capacity going in that zone. And that's also requiring a fairly sizable amount of headroom to be added to the system. So the model could be seeing that and saying, okay, C is where I can optimize for both my need for SM or high capital low operating energy, but also has space for headroom, and that's why it could choose this zone, and also why it might choose other zones for smaller increments. So hopefully that helps too.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, and I skipped this slide on the storage, so I'll come back to this one quick. So we're seeing more storage in sensitivity 5, particularly in like zone J and K, and that's because the storage is being seen as more economic than the fuel cell to meet the capacity needs in those zones. And then last section here, again on representative days and sort of how the system is seeing the operation, is this is typical representative day plot as we've seen, but what we've also done for this one is we've split out the high capital low operating and the fuel cell. So typically we have all the DFIRs lumped together, but we split them out because there's some interesting stuff to be seen here with the data. On the high capital low operating option, you can see that it is really operating like a baseload generator, versus the fuel cell option in the solid purple is operating on peak period. So it's operating like a peaker unit, both in summer and winter peak or near peak conditions, which are represented by this section here. but also in a period where there's a high energy demand, but there's a low solar output. So in both cases where there's a combination with low solar, we see the fuel cell option running. And this is compared to the state scenario where we only have the hydrogen combustion option represented by the hashed purple bar here, and where it's primarily only operating as a peaker. It doesn't serve any sort of base load. It's just a different unit operating in a different way. And then finally, we show a bit of a delta here to show that the DFR options are replacing a lot of the renewable energy that we were seeing in the state scenario. So so yeah, that wraps up really everything I wanted to get into, but happy to field questions on this.
Veronica, go ahead.
Yep, I have a couple of questions. If you go back to the zonal slide with what's being added, I think just based on the size, it's like zone J, or like the other slide that was showing differ by zone. Yeah, this one. So you would think of those additions as maybe small modular reactor, 500 megawatt. In zone B and C, maybe it can be both large and small. But I have a question on whether there was any consideration as well on siting of those resources and feasibility of siting those in those zones.
I think a lot of that is going to have to come down to future stages of the CGBP, and it's very similar to like the issue that we're going to run into in like scenario 3, for example, when we're having to site, somewhere between 12 and 16,000 megawatts of batteries in zone J, or in other scenarios where there might be 15 or 20 gigawatts of solar in a single zone. All of these have various feasibility challenges, whether it's land use, land availability, permitting, those types of issues. So we're going to have to kind of lump all of those constraints in for whatever resource we're talking about, and consider all of those constraints when we're actually doing the nodal analysis, and try to address that, because we are trying to move feasible results through the rest of the CGPP, so we can identify the needs. But I totally take the point. If we're trying to drop 500 megawatt units of anything anywhere, that's a really significant type of resource, and it's going to have some unique siting challenges.
Thank you. And another question, just to clarify, I would like to understand better, like how the decision is made on differs. Are you deciding differs based on the capacity needs, and then fixing those differs? It also replaces like in this case, some of the large scale renewables because of the high capacity factor, low operating cost. How is the deferred decision being made in the model?
Yeah, I think it's the model is looking at a combination of things. So first, it's looking at the cost. The high capital low operating option, for example, has a fairly high cost relative to like renewables, for example. But it also is optimizing, the model needs energy. It needs to satisfy the load. And it also needs to satisfy any sort of capacity requirements that we have in the model. So I think what we're seeing in this case where we add high capital, low operating is, despite that unit being expensive, it is able to serve both the energy and the capacity need. So the model is optimizing based on a multitude of factors. So does that help, or can I clarify anything?
Yeah, I think it helps. It helps. I think what you are saying is because like in the state scenario, for instance, the differs are like at the end, they are not economic on the energy side, but you need them for capacity needs. So you need that dispatchable energy emission-free resource. So here you are adding those capacity, but when you add this capacity that also has low operating cost, it seems to displace renewables, but renewables have zero cost, or like they still have a lower cost than like nuclear, for instance, variable operating cost. But I guess the capacity piece is more important. The capacity constraint and the ELCC value of those resources, it's more important than the, and I guess maybe you have them as almost like must run because they have capacity, they have high capacity factor. So you need to, do you force them in the model, or do you have you run them at the operating cost, variable operating cost? Are they must run, or?
Are the renewables must run? Is that what you're
No,
asking?
the nuclear, the high capex, low operating cost.
No, it's not must run, and so it does have an associated like variable cost and a fixed operating cost as well. But I think a key of what you were mentioning is like the ELCCs. That's certainly an important driver. Like if the model wants to build renewables, that nameplate capacity is only going to account for like a fairly small percentage of like firm capacity that'll go towards IRM, like a level IRM and the LCR for the downstate zones, whereas this high capital low operating option has a firm capacity that's close to 100%. So as this resource gets added to the system, it provides a lot of value from that front, versus if you wanted to get the equivalent capacity value on renewables, you'd have to add a lot more.
Thank you. And the last question, on the cap, like the TND versus, like this sensitivity shows that we don't need as much incremental headroom as in the state scenario. But I'm wondering if you have looked at what's the capital cost of those differs compared to the reduction, the savings in TND. Because because like you will have like the state, or as a system, you'll have to spend the money to build those differs high capex. So how would that higher cost compare to the reduction in TND in the incremental headroom? Looks like.
Well, the model would see, when it's trying to decide between, building more renewables or building this high capital cost, low operating cost resource, it's comparing the capital cost of that resource to the renewable cost plus any additional, storage to meet reliability needs and headroom that it needs to build. So it's basically seeing that the renewables plus whatever firming plus whatever headroom is actually more expensive than using the thing that costs more, 2 to 3 times more to build, but doesn't have those other associated costs coming with it.
Okay, so it's that optimization is done in the model.
Yeah, the model is actually seeing that happen. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Skylar, one other question on that, on the model.
Yeah.
I'm assuming each resource type has a life cycle time period, and that they may differ by resource type. Does the model capture that?
I don't think so. We're modeling out till 2040, and so basically anything that's built, our first time step is 2025. So anything's built in 2025 and beyond is basically assumed to live for those 15 to 17 years. We don't actually spread that beyond beyond that 2042 timeframe.
So just for sake of example, so if one resource type has a 40 or 50-year life cycle and another one has a 20-year, right now the model's treating both of them kind of similar, correct?
I think so. I'll look to the NISO folks just to make sure I'm understanding that correctly. But I think the model's really just seeing what's the cheapest capital plus operating costs to hit all of our energy needs in each of the years it's modeling. It's not necessarily saying we're making investments, NPV out to 2070 and making sure that the total, loads being hit in every single year for at least total NPV over the entire life of all the assets. But I think it's just seeing those initial costs, and the lifetime doesn't necessarily come into it. Is that right, Kevin?
That sounds right to me as well. Yeah, and if that is different, we can follow up. We'll look at it, but I think your understanding is the same as mine.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Chris. If we need to make some kind of qualitative statements about how we might expect that difference to kind of spread out across this, for example, some scenarios that might lean a lot heavier on short duration storage assets for reliability, those assets tend to have somewhere between like a 12 to 15-year lifetime. And so that's obviously something that might have bearing when we're talking about having a system that's, both resilient in the near term, but also, existing in a similar cost and reliability out to 2050 and beyond, because we also have targets in 2050. So we want to make sure we're making good decisions throughout the whole lifetime. And if some of these assets might kind of be reaching the end of their useful life in 2045, for example, that's something we would need to take into account.
Okay, thanks, Skylar.
Skylar, Bill Acker here.
Go ahead, Bill.
So, these are really interesting results in this new version of the scenario. It does lead me to think that we had requested doing a DFR scenario, and NIRPS particularly requested doing a long duration storage scenario as part of that. And we kind of built the DFR scenario with the idea that it would be general and it would cover long duration storage, modular, flexible nuclear, other things that could be in here in the high capital cost, low operating cost scenarios. And clearly the idea of a DFR in people's minds was the kind of dispatchable as opposed to base load scenario. And it's interesting that the model's finding that basically a base load asset's valuable here. What's not then being really compared here, though, is the comparison of long duration storage to this generalized version that's it wouldn't be long duration storage because it's base load. So it leads me to think that we really ought to still look at long duration storage, and it might be that we need to have a different sensitivity that actually incorporates the various different durations of long duration storage. And I know you and I have talked about the fact that means different capital costs, because it's long duration storage can mean 16 hours, it can mean 24 hours, it can mean 100 hours, it can mean all different durations, and each one has a different capital cost. So it's a we were in this kind of situation where we're trying to get as much as we possibly could out of one sensitivity, and it looks like we got valuable information, but that didn't actually give us the information on the long duration storage side of things. So I would encourage us to think about doing an additional sensitivity where we actually put in more of the parameters of long duration storage, and then we can take a look. And I suspect that the right answer in the future probably is a mixture of the both. And we may not be able to run that sensitivity, but at least we have some idea of comparison points here.
Yeah, I think those are all great points, Bill. I know before we ran this, we weren't sure how the model was going to see this asset or how it was going to want to dispatch it, because a lot of times when you have a really high solar system, the resources aren't necessarily going to want to run all the time throughout the entire day, because you typically have resource excess in the middle of the day. So we weren't actually sure how this would work, and if the dispatch of these things were maybe at a lower capacity factor, and we're kind of deferring to those renewables during the middle of the day, that would have given us a little bit more indication of where something like nuclear is more valuable versus something like long duration storage is more valuable. But when we actually plug it into the model is seeing, you know, a lot of value in avoiding, like, for example, on this slide, we're avoiding like 7,000 or 8,000 megawatts of headroom. That's a lot. That's very valuable. You know, we're avoiding a lot of overbuilds of renewables and storage in certain areas and DFERs to kind of build these other things. And it's doing it by running an asset almost continuously most of the year. It's just finding that firm energy being really valuable. And that decision that the model's making about the dispatch is favoring, you know, something that's more like nuclear than long duration storage. And so I agree that the results kind of don't support the long duration storage as having been in the model as much as we thought it might at the beginning. And it might point to needing to do something else if we're trying to explicitly get long duration storage exclusive results. We're still in those discussions trying to figure out what we might be able to do in Plexos. We've had some discussions with other you know, consulting firms that have done this and Energy Exemplar to figure out what a near-term tweak could be, and we're not really coming up with anything anything beyond the 8-hour duration storage. It might have to be kind of a post-processing thing, but I totally agree with you. We gotta this did not serve as much of a long duration storage dispatch as we could have expected at the beginning.
Well, I appreciate your continuing to look into ways to model it. So thank you.
You know, on a similar line, this is Shadab again. So I guess my general question is, at what point in this process you will decide? You know, there's a set of technology, the technology that are today viable, they are working operational, versus the future technology that we don't know whether they will be viable or not. Plus, you know, even if they are practically operational, you know, then there is a question of can you actually construct that in those sensitive areas, right? So how are you going to decide? Because this is so important, generational placement, and that will decide the overall scope of this, you know, this activity here, right? At what point, how are you going to decide about the technology? I think that is so critical, whether it's a storage or, I know we are calling them DFER, but at the end of the day, some of those technology are in the development phase. We don't know when they will be functional and can you even construct them in those sensitive areas, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? Because we're dropping something that says, quote unquote, you know, 8-hour storage into the model at a certain cost, but which technology that actually is has slightly different round trip efficiency. It'll have slightly different operating characteristics, ramp rates, those types of things. Same with hydrogen fueled resources. You know, we have a few kind of lab scale and real world pilots of what combustion resources might be. We have, you know, a few tens of megawatts of fuel cells that we have some data on, but that doesn't necessarily prove what the cost and operational characteristics of those resources are going to be in 2040. So there's a lot of estimation and research that has to be done that's kind of estimating all of these things, and those are parameters that, based on this cycle of this CGPP, we can't move forward without making some assumption on that, right? We have to have some number in the model and some data to actually run any of this analysis on. And so it's really about getting the best available data on all of those things and plugging those numbers in the model. Like what's the ramp rate? What's the fuel cost of these types of resources? And trying to vet those assumptions and use the best ones we have to come up with inputs that can then result in outputs regarding, you know, the operating characteristics, the grid needs, the land use constraints. So that's kind of our main issues here, and why I think one of the reasons it's actually taken over a year to even do this stage one, because this is when a lot of those assumptions had to be developed. So that's, you know, to answer your question, like when are we really nailing that down? It happens kind of depending on what parameter you're talking about. It happens at varying stages of the CGPP. A lot of the operating characteristics of these assets, these future type assets, were decided through the scoping process of these stage one capacity expansion modeling scenarios and sensitivities. And the actual data on those assumptions are spread out through various EPAC materials. They're on the website. You can always email me if you have a question on one of them. But then some of the other information about where these assets are going to be interconnected, how do they impact the power flow, what are their characteristics in a stability analysis. Those are things that are going to be developed over the next 6 months to a year in the rest of the modeling stages. And I think you're right. We don't know what inverter a fuel cell might use in 2040, but we know generally how inverters work, and we have estimates of the operating characteristics of a fuel cell now, and that's what we're going to be running our simulations on. So that's just one example, but I think that's kind of the general overview of how all this data is kind of coming together.
Appreciate that. I just want to offer, this is great, right? We did this all, desktop work analysis, making some assumptions, right? But now we need to take it to the next step where we will do the transmission analysis, come up with the need, and select some project to do it, right? And that is a big work, right? We're making those selections based on certain assumptions that may or may not come to fruition, right? I guess, in my view, there has to have some hedging in this, right? If some of those technology does not come to fruition, or you cannot actually construct them, I mean, we need to have a plan that is still good enough, right? So my question was more about, for example, let's say you think scenario 5 is the best, and you move forward with scenario 5. But scenario 5 is so much heavily built upon the assumption of a storage, and maybe SMR defer, and maybe you don't have enough space or enough siting location, or maybe the technology will not pan out the way we are thinking today, then that plan is not going to work. And as you know, it takes 10 years to build transmission system, right? We don't want to wait and watch what will happen for 5 years and then figure out, oh, no, this is not working now. People back to drawing board again, right? So I think keeping that in mind, my main question was like, how you feel comfortable moving forward with some of those big assumptions?
Oh, I would love to hear if anybody on this call is super comfortable because I think I'm going to, once this recording is complete, I think we're going to kind of like clip out what you just said and save that, because I think that was the perfect kind of explanation of why everything we're doing here is so difficult and requires this type of sensitivity analysis and scenario analysis, because like all of this stuff is very uncertain, especially out in those later years when I think if you were on a couple of EPACs ago, the NISO did a great comparison about the pathways to 2035 and then beyond, and a lot of these scenarios very, very similar to 2030, very, very similar to 2035, but then based on the ultimate electrification rates and the ultimate defer options that are in all these scenarios, they diverge quite a bit between 2035 and 2040. And so like those later years are extremely uncertain with the technologies and with the transmission build outs. So I think one of the way I'm approaching this is like, I'm trying to make sure that in this very first phase, this first cycle of the CGPP, we have that broad-based scenario analysis and we have the best available information today, so we can really analyze across all those scenarios what type of resources and transmission might be needed in 2030 and 2035, because those are the years where most of these build outs are mostly the same. So it kind of mitigates that, that pathway risk, like you were just saying. If you pick one pathway that relies on one specific type of resource in one region and it doesn't pan out, you've taken a huge risk and you might have, a lot of issues with that. So we're trying in this first stage to make sure we get a really good estimate of those nearer term needs and kind of use our optionality value in future cycles of the CGPP to redo all of this analysis when we might have a better sense of how likely things like nuclear are, how much hydrogen might be available, what other technologies might exist in those later years, and hopefully have a lot better insight in the future about what those, narrow the divergence of those pathways out to 2040. But I think you articulated the problem, I think, perfectly, and that's what we're trying to deal with here with all the scenarios.
Thank you. My last comment is comment is I would encourage to be cautious with the assumptions. I think that's a good approach. You want to have that portfolio for the short-term and long-term needs, but I think we need to have the right long-term plan, and that plan should have a low risk in terms of assumptions. If we are making a big risk assumption, that's a problem, I think, in my view. So I think we just need to be careful about that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, Skylar Billacker again. Just to build on that, 'cause I think you raised some really good points that last discussion. The only thing I would differ slightly with the last statement is I think it's really important. We don't have a singular long-term plan. We are going to have a lot of possibilities going forward, and I think that's exactly why you painted the picture of having multiple scenarios and actually analyzing every single one of those scenarios that we're doing, so that we can look at where we're going and have that optionality as we go forward. And I just want to confirm that is the plan, that we're going to carry all three of those through the complete analysis and the solution set as part of this process.
Yes, that's the plan. Trying to have 3 diverging scenarios that go through the entire analysis of capacity expansion, power flow stability, and production cost, and then another set of capacity expansion and solutions development. So yes, that is the plan, and we might be surprised where the kind of the transmission needs in all those scenarios are roughly the same, and then the nature has mitigated our risk for us. But I think in the more likely scenario, we're going to see 3 scenarios, 3 plans that are similar for a while and then diverge quite a bit based on the long-term divergences in both the load forecast and the resource availability. But I think that's necessary and important at this stage to know those different futures to inform the commission on what pathways are more likely, more cost effective, and which transmission solutions in these early days are kind of, I don't want to say quote unquote no regrets, but are kind of shared among the various scenarios.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And because the other thing we haven't talked a lot about here is the, we talked a lot about the generation mix, but even the load side is incredibly uncertain in 2042 as well. So
Yeah.
we would get anyone that says they have the plan to 2042, I would highly question. It's got to be multiple probabilistic approaches.
Yeah. I think the NISO had one data point that was like in every scenario, the load forecast is at least 80% higher than the load today. So adding 80% of our state load, that introduces a lot of risk and uncertainty and where and when that'll show up. So I agree, the scenario analysis is pretty important, but I think I get the point of the other speaker as well about how long all this takes, and the longer we push off the uncertainty and the longer we take to commit to something, the less likely it is we ultimately succeed in any one path. So I think that I take both points. Radhika, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, maybe a comment building on what Ali has mentioned, because you make the point now and during the last EPAC call about the needs, the long-term needs, and that we will not go shopping for all the transmission needs in this first CGPP. But as Ali mentioned, it's like it takes 10 years to build transmission once it's approved. So, and some of those scenarios could be maybe very aggressive on the deployment. For instance, the sensitivity number 5, when you think about, let's say, nuclear, and that can be the case for other differs too. But for nuclear, realistically, it can be, maybe 15 years to have those in place. And that's like when there's a solid business case for those players to develop and build and take the balance, it's huge capital projects. So, and there is no incentive today to do that from a developer standpoint, because the curves are not justifying building nuclear, going merchant and building nuclear. So some of those assumptions could be very aggressive. And when you look at how long it takes to build transmission, and then like if 20% of the needs are met by some of those differs, that it's a little bit worrisome from a reliability standpoint too, if you make that bet. Mm-hmm. And so my comments are around what is the thinking on what are we supposed to be solving in the CGPP? What needs through 2042? Is there a decision to actually only look through 2035? When was that decision made, maybe? And is one scenario more important than another? How is this all kind of like going to play out?
Oh, yeah, I wish I had that crystal ball, but I've been speculating kind of live on this meeting about how I think this might end up playing out. But the goal here of the CGPP is to go all the way through 2040 because we're operating under compliance with CLCPA and AREGBA to do a long-term transmission plan out to 2040 to determine the amount of transmission that's required, transmission distribution that's required to meet the CLCPA targets. So the goal of the CGPP process is for the utilities to do all this analysis and file a report that says, in these various scenarios, here's what it would take to hit the CLCPA. So that's the process. The outcome in the end is that the commission is going to see all of that, and they're going to have the ability to act one way or the other on what transmission assets to approve. And the stuff I've said so far about how the plans might be similar in the earlier years and diverge in the later years, and it might make it easier to make decisions about funding earlier stage projects versus projects that are only necessary for 2040 or beyond. That's just me speculating, right? I have no idea what the projects are going to look like or which ones are going to look more certain or be the same across scenarios. But the goal here is just to come up with the needs, to identify the needs. There is no requirement in the law that we have to approve everything, nothing, approve things that are needed in 2030 versus 2035. That's not laid out anywhere. That's just a decision that is left up to the commission about what needs may arise, how certain are we of them being needed, and which ones do we want to approve, sometime in 2026 versus waiting for future cycles. So that's something that's going to be determined at a later date. Go ahead, Chris.
Hey, Skylar, just one other question, and it might be unrelated, but we're looking here, you mentioned till about 2040-ish timeframe. Will this information through this process potentially be utilized in the state energy planning process, or are they separate and distinct kind of paths?
That's a really good question. I don't think they're completely separate and distinct because the energy plan, it recognizes all the stuff that has gone on and is going on right now. And the energy plan has certain guidelines based on the legislation of what has to go in there. I think if we have a lot of information that the energy plan is required to present, I would advocate for a lot of this stuff to be incorporated in there because we kind of are already doing a very public process developing a lot of these insights. But there's nothing mandated that says, energy plan has to use CGPP data or vice versa. So I think it remains to be seen how exactly these two things fit together. But we, as the CGPP and the EPAC, we're generating information and insights that are definitely going to be valuable for folks working on the state energy plan to look at. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, Skylar, it's Keith here. Since I want to acknowledge we've covered all the slides that we had planned to today. I think the slides are posted, but I did want to circle back. I think Nick Culpepper is still on. Nick, are you on still?
Yes, good afternoon, Keith.
Great. I want to circle back to the question you raised earlier about the Zone K utility scale solar in Zone K as to whether or not the model reached the capacity limitation. And the answer to that is yes, it did, specific for Zone K. Thank you.
Thanks. That makes sense. I think that's in line with state scenario as well. Thank you.
Back to you, Skylar.
Thanks, Keith. All right. If there's no other questions or comments right now, I think we'll go ahead and close the call. I know we are still expecting a couple of more sensitivities to be run that we know of. One with a even higher DER deployment, and then one that's looking to develop a scenario with no DFER requirements in downstate New York. So those two are still in the process of being scoped and then run. So we don't have a firm date of when those results would be. So we don't have a firm date for a future EPAC meeting yet, but we'll be in touch about those. And as always, feel free to reach out with any questions in the meantime. But thanks for all the great questions, great comments and discussion today. And I think we'll close the meeting now. Thanks. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.